Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This week on the show, we have a very special guest. She is an expert in science communication and in the study of climate and the psychology of how we deal with some of the challenges with climate change. Her name is Dr. Britt Wray. She's an author and director of Circle at Stanford Psychiatry, which is a research and action initiative focused on community minded interventions for resilience, climate leadership, and emotional well being in the Stanford School of Medicine. Britt is the author of two books. Her latest is Generation Dread: Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Anxiety. She's the recipient of the 2023 Canadian Eco Hero Award and the top award winner of the National Academy's Eric and Wendy Schmidt Awards for Excellence in Science Communications, which is where I met her earlier this year. She's got a fantastic book. I'm really excited to talk to her. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Britt. It's great to see you.
It's so nice to see you, Cassie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I want to start with maybe just framing this topic a little bit. And there's a term that you used in near the introduction of your book, and it's this term of eco anxiety and kind of the sense of anxiety and dread and worry that many of us who are aware of what's happening in the climate might be feeling, or those of us that are already experiencing the the effects of what's happening with climate change. So maybe we start there. What is eco anxiety?
Absolutely. It's a good question. It means many things. So, it's been described by the American Psychological Association as the chronic fear of environmental doom, which says
Mm,
a lot. It gives us a feeling and a flavor for the kind of uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that come along when we may be confronting the climate crisis and other forms of environmental degradation, the biodiversity crisis, and planetary ill health. Essentially, it is more than just anxiety, despite the term being simplified to anxiety. It's kind of an umbrella of
mhm,
distress that includes anxiety, fear, sadness, sense of grief, perhaps for environmental losses. For some, it might be hopelessness or despair
mm.
or a feeling of powerlessness when dealing with the enormity and the overwhelming task that science tells us we have ahead of us in order to protect humanity going forth. So, it is not a mental disorder, despite the clinical sounding name. Eco anxiety and its sister, climate anxiety, which is just about smaller subsets of concern that relate to the climate emergency as opposed to all forms of environmental stresses. Uh, it has been argued by researchers and clinicians in recent years that there's actually nothing pathological about feeling some of these things. Although they're very uncomfortable, they are rational and appropriate to go through from time to time when dealing with the implications of what the data sets tell us, and especially when squaring what we know is a real unfolding existential threat with the lack of effective action from power holders, from global leaders, from politicians, from major corporates to reduce emissions and to meet our climate targets and to stop destroying natural environments, right? In order for humans to have things that we want and economies to grow and so on. This is often happening at the cost of these negative externalities to the planet and to people. So
Yeah.
therefore, it's not something to be ashamed of, but it is something to learn how to deal with in a way that you can protect your mental health, because for some, it can become so burdensome that it has led to problems with sleeping, to panic attacks, to
Mhm.
eating disorders, to even suicidal thinking. And therefore, there is a threshold that we notice that can be crossed, or if it shows up with pre-existing mental disorders, then it can really be a severe threat to well-being and deserve some attention.
Yeah. When I love in the opening of your book, you use terms like this of it is normal, it is suitable, it is humane, it is understandable to have these feelings. And I just want to read a short excerpt for the audience just to get some context and framing here. And this is from the beginning of your book, and this is after you've told this incredible story of a young woman trying to help her father save their home from a fire from these wildfires that were occurring during a drought period in Australia. But you write, It is normal to get anxious about mass migrations and resource scarcity, increasing the risk of violence and war. It is appropriate to grieve when the UN reports that humans are driving up to 1 million species to extinction, many within mere decades. You go on to talk about the logic, understandability of these different sentiments and feelings. And I mean, myself, I really think a lot about biodiversity loss as part of my own research, and our the security of our food systems, the security of our future medicines. And it's challenging to talk about these things because they do really elicit such an emotional reaction, right? So I was just wondering, yeah, maybe you can elaborate a bit more on some of these feelings that people have and the normality of that.
Absolutely. So we know that we can only grieve for that we feel love towards, right? Grief is the cost of attachment, as they say. And as things that are precious to us are being destabilized and threatened, our grief is going to show. It's been suggested that climate anxiety might be better understood as climate compassion instead, that it's a sign of our care and concern for all that is in harm's way. And therefore, it is this badge of our humanity. It is something that we can show up to with pride rather than with shame, which is typically, unfortunately, the way that many might show up to these thoughts and feelings, wondering if they're deviant for caring so much and wondering if they're the only one who feels the weight of the world on their shoulders in this way because we lack social norms for talking with each other about it. As you just mentioned, it's difficult. It is difficult, but it's also that we perpetually disenfranchise these feelings when we don't talk about them. And actually, psychologists talk about disenfranchised grief as grief that is not recognized, that is difficult to move through social support because it's taboo or just too painful or awkward to talk about with others. We often see this in the case of miscarriages, let's say, and suicides and abortions and losses that are difficult to bring up at the dinner table. Similarly, around the water cooler, we're not talking about the pang of grief we might feel when the Pacific Northwest heat dome happens and a billion marine animals get washed up on shore, or the anxiety and the sleeplessness we might feel when worrying about our children and the climate emergency that they're inheriting, looking into decades into the future from now, and so on. And that is a damaging cycle of silence around what are very normal affective responses that we know from looking at the emerging studies on this that many of us are feeling, especially if we have any ounce of what's called environmental identity, which is where we feel a connection to the more than human world, right? That we understand that we're part of a greater interconnected web of living systems and that our life support systems are in dire difficult shape. So that interconnection, our interbeing with them, results to us feeling the stress of the earth within our own bodies, really. And I think as scientists especially, it's difficult to talk about these things because scientists are trained to be objective, right? We don't want to taint the data or the way that we discuss it, the implications of it for policy change or what have you, with any kind of emotional vehemence, because then we could be seen as being advocates or activists and as being biased and manipulative and so on. So any kind of emotion is very carefully avoided or extracted as artifactual noise when we're talking about scientific topics like biodiversity loss, because we want to protect the importance of the research so that it can make real change in the world, but don't want to be judged by power holders for being, yeah, crybabies, emotional, whatever it is. And so that really has, I think, also made change making very difficult from a scientific perspective historically because of that really careful attention to not want to be seen by people in Congress or whatever as having a bias. However, it leaves the heart out of the movement, out of the science. It leaves the guts out of it. And as the emergency we're dealing with becomes more and more existential, we need to move people in ways that change has always been achieved, which is through shared grievances, through social change, through movement building, which always has an undercurrent of emotions. And so you see now more and more climate scientists saying, enough with this, pretending that I'm not a full human that doesn't also feel this stuff. I'm going to voice it and I'm going to get in the streets and I'm going to talk about why these emotions matter.
Yeah. No, that's so well put, and, I mean, you also got into this concept of generational differences and how we react to this. On one end of the spectrum, you may have some of older generations that aren't as worried about this, maybe because their clock is running out and they're not think but then there are others that do think very, very carefully about this because this is a legacy we're leaving for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. What have you noted in generational perspectives on this? Is this something that only millennials care about? Or yeah, what have you observed in your research?
I've definitely observed that people from all walks of life and all age groups can feel this. And really, anyone who, yes, has that sense of environmental identity we already talked about, but also just understands that their own health is caught up with the health of the environment, then comes to the logical conclusion that they're in danger and everything that they love is in danger. And therefore, they're going to feel these things. However, there are huge generational differences in the science. The data backs that up. That young people, understandably so, are more vexed about this. They feel more angst. They feel more institutional betrayal and moral distress as they are inheriting a planet plagued by these problems at a time when those with power, those who have the ability to shift the needle, aren't doing what they can with the time that they are currently embodying, where they could change policies, where they could have different corporate practices, where the greenwashing and advertisements from polluters in the fossil fuel industry could be made illegal, but it's not, in order to mislead the public and so on. And therefore, this feels like a huge intergenerational injustice because not only did young people not live the high intensive carbon lifestyles for decades that have created the problem, they're also being told that they are the great hope for solving it. And it's like, why am I left holding the bag for all of these affordances that you enjoyed just because I was born at this time? And then I should not be the big gleaming hope to solve this. You should do everything that you can right now while you have more power. Often, young people aren't even old enough to vote, let alone, run Fortune 500 companies and run for office. So, all those things intertwine mean that they feel the psychological distress in ways that can become functionally impairing and really threaten mental health, but also for some, just massively galvanizing. And we've seen such fierce climate leadership from young generations as fueled by these emotions. Greta Thunberg, maybe most notably amongst them, who has been really explicit about the anxiety and despair and sense of hopelessness that has driven her conviction and courage. But there are many others. And so, and yeah, unfortunately, there's kind of that glib knee jerk reaction you can hear from some elders who are like, well, before stuff really hits the fan, thankfully I'll be out of here. And I feel for the younger ones, but what can I do? That kind of a, which is just not good enough for young people. So yeah, those are some of the general trends
Yeah.
that you observe, but also marginalized communities.
Yeah.
It's not just youth who are particularly vulnerable to this distress. Those who know that they're on the front lines of disaster in more hazard impacted areas due to histories of environmental racism, redlining, policies that have shoved historically marginalized populations into more vulnerable areas that are more polluted, that are next to polluting
Mm.
chemical plants and so on, air pollution, plus susceptibility to disasters. We see more climate distress in those groups too. Um, indigenous communities, those who are facing mobility issues, which actively endangers the elderly and people living with disabilities. People are experiencing extreme poverty, women, anyone who's living in close relationship to landscapes that are changing, like outdoor workers and ranchers and farmers. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different ways and reasons why some people might be able to get in touch with these emotions more than others.
Yeah. When you touched on something that I think comes up a lot, even in my lectures, my research is on plants, biodiversity, but antibiotic resistance. And when I talk about climate change and then the threat of antibiotic resistance, I mean, these are really deep, dark issues, very difficult to solve.
Yeah,
And I think that for many of these issues, there's not like a clear and easy answer to getting to a solution. And so that can, I think, in many ways lead us to a point of hopelessness and a point of becoming frozen, incapacitated.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering in your research and in your writing, like, what are some things that you've found can help to foster hope, that can help to provide people with that impetus or that reassurance that even as individuals, we can make change happen? Like, what are those talking points?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that we get hope backwards a lot of the time in these kinds of difficult to solve polycrisis issues that we're facing because we think that we need to feel hopeful in order to get off the couch and act. And what the history of social movements and social change shows us, as well as what some of the research implies, is that hope is not a feeling. It's not a prerequisite. It's actually the byproduct of action. And so by rolling up your sleeves and getting together with others and finding yourself enmeshed in a community of caring others who feel the same and are also finding ways to address it, breaking down the problem into tinier parts where you can actually wrap your arms around it is key because it's too overwhelming when it just remains out there as a Timothy Morton, the philosopher, calls climate change a hyper object. And that's when things are just so vast you can't see where they start or end because it shows up in everything from what comes out of your tailpipes to who you vote for and how you heat your home and what your climate anxious teenager might be saying after a climate science lecture and so on. So when you can't see where it starts or ends, you can't intervene, but you got to break it down into something that you can wrestle with to get a foothold and see others doing the same. And then the possibility for collective hope becomes available. But I think that there's also more in this space because despair, powerlessness, in the sense of like it's all so baked in and I'm only one person and what can I do? There's there's a real galvanizing power of learning how to manage these emotions by going into them and not avoiding them. So rather than seeing them as an obstacle or something to paper over or beat back or suppress, actually seeing them as the path, as the solution actually is that you can become existentially resilient enough to face them and sit with them and to hold the uncertainty of how massive this crisis is and how we're really going to band together to solve it. Then you can start to get to the far side of despair and you can build up some gritty courage and see other people who also have that kind of mindset. And then that starts to breed the hope of, as you, what resources you have to be able to stay with the trouble for the long term. Stay with the trouble is this statement from Donna Haraway, another kind of critical theorist, which is applicable to both your area of study and mine. It's like we're wrestling with this and we're not giving up. Some people talk about it as stubborn optimism or a form of active hope. And I think all these things are about knowing that no matter how hard pressed against the wall you are pushed, because it is right to take action in the present moment, you will continue doing that to try and align your values with the way you're showing up in the world, regardless of what that likelihood of success is, right? Because it is right action in the present moment. It's kind of a Buddhist idea, taking right action. And you release that attachment to outcome. Because if you're constantly focused on needing to know that your actions are going to pay off, you will burn out because you can't source that certainty. And yeah, so I see that a lot in these spaces, but I also notice time and again, especially climate activists, climate scientists, people who are really, they got their head in the oven of this difficult information day in, day out. They often say that the most restorative, the most healing for them is really the community piece. It's really coming into deep relationships with others who are similarly grappling and caring, and that it's just so much worse when you feel you're alienated in it and that you're alone in it,
Yeah,
and then you can find the conviction to keep going.
that's so yeah. That's so true. I think building community in some ways is also about building your own resilience. Would you agree? Like, or how do we foster, let me back up. I get too far ahead of myself. What is resilience? What is psychological resilience? And what actions can we take to build more resilience so that we're better equipped to deal with these big problems?
Yeah, it's a big and really juicy question because resilience is one of those terms that's been defined in a million different ways by a million different disciplines. And, the kind of basic understanding of resilience is being able to bounce back after adversity, right? So some awful upheaval comes and turns your life upside down. You find a way of coming back to baseline of where you were before that adversity hit. But many will say, you know what? Bouncing back to baseline is not good enough, especially not in the climate crisis, because many of us were not doing well in the first place. We're coming from historically marginalized communities. We don't have the resources to meet our needs. What we need is a kind of transformational resilience where we can understand that, yeah, these threats are huge and heavy and they're hurting us, but then through the process of rebuilding, we can build back better. We can recreate a world in which we can live more comfortably, in which we can safeguard the air and that we need to breathe that's clean, and the water and the nutritious food and the strength in our community and our social capital, our ability to achieve shared goals about things that we care about in the places where we live, so that we are empowering ourselves to build a more livable restorative future and know what that looks like, because right now it's not good. And this is not acceptable, so we need to make it better. And so a lot of the resilience definitions in the climate space are about how we use this crisis as an opportunity to be more caring, to be less, to live less in this cannibalistic form of capitalism that is eating the future, and set up other ways of showing up and living in relationship with the planet, with the more than human world, with other species, uh, that doesn't just disregard them or disregard human well-being. So yeah, but psychological resilience, it's how do we have the reserves to and the mental health, the state of good mental health, which is needed to take on all this complex structural change work, right? In your field and in mine, because that requires resources, mental, emotional, physical resources. And if people are so bottomed out, tapped out, burnt out, depleted, depressed, numb, lethargic, detached, that their cup is empty, then what happens? Like, we just focus on day-to-day survival when we're in that kind of state. We don't have the capacity to be spacious, reflexive, generous. And it's that whole adage about, put on your own oxygen mask before you help someone else with theirs. You got to have the internal ability to do that, to be useful to structural change, because it takes a lot. Therefore, psychological resilience, part of it just means the basic ability to know how to care for yourself and get those needs
Yeah.
taken care of in a difficult situation, in an ongoing long-term crisis. So I think that there's a really cool model that I like to talk about, which has been published in the last year by a Finnish researcher named Panu Pikula, for how people move through eco distress, eco anxiety, and grief in ways that are restorative and protect their mental health, and also allow them to be useful to action and change making. And it basically says that all of us go from a state at one point of not knowing about the climate crisis to semi-knowing, a state of, they call it disavowal, having one eye open to the truth of how bad it is and the other eye closed. So it's not that we're a denier, it's just that we're only appreciating it intellectually, and then something happens, or some kind of trigger event that will make it become emotionally overwhelming to us as well. So we can't just think about it, we're now thinking and feeling about it. And that can become, for some people, so overwhelming that it causes a really destabilizing effect, or it feels like a shock response, or a shattering within them, or a sense that the world is ending, or there's all kinds of ways in which people might voice that. And then, depending on our personality and experiences, things that happened to us as a child, traumas, etc., we might be one of three types of people. We might be really gut centered, and by that it means like want to externalize our pain through action and be a despair free activist or really effective researcher or policymaker, whatever it is. And then we try to bypass the pain by just working through it. But if we don't have internal resources, we might burn out. So that's not good for mental health. If we're a very head centered person, we might be very vigilant and very anxious, and we might not even be able to tolerate the full spectrum of thoughts and feelings that come with our climate awareness. And so we avoid it. And there we see a lot of people kind of sticking their head in the sand, being the ostrich, because it's too painful, right? It just raises too many uncomfortable feelings. But if we're really heart centered, meaning we are very emotional. We might get lost in grief work and get really far deep down into despairing crevices of fatalism or a sense of doom or, feeling that the die is cast, there's nothing we can do, which can also preclude a lot of solutions and damage mental health because it leads to depression. And so the model says that it's only when people learn how to integrate healthy amounts of all three. So yes, action, so that we narrow the gap between the ways that we're acting right now and then what our values are, which brings relief because when those things are really out of alignment, say we really care about the climate crisis, but we're working a really polluting job, we suffer unconsciously often for that. We can feel a lot of psychic strain. So narrowing that is key, and it also helps with change making. But then for the head centered person who was formerly so anxious that they were unconscious about how much they were distancing themselves from the problem, that then flips into taking conscious breaks. So allowing yourself to say, I'm not going to focus on this right now so that I can go do fun, joyous things and like have a great life on these days and not be burdened by the climate crisis and be a full human and indulge in self-care. And, Audre Lorde said self-care is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And it's that idea that we
Oh,
need
I
to know
like
how to
that.
take care of ourselves. Yeah, to do this difficult work for the long haul that can't be solved in the short term.
Yeah.
And then for the person who was very emotional, heart-centered, instead of getting lost in grief or dark places, it's more about knowing emotionally intelligent skills and ways of being able to integrate and manage difficult thoughts and feelings, which might come from contemplative practices, wisdom traditions, mindfulness, meditation, therapeutic experiences, somatic work, spiritual connections, whatever it is that restores you. So then when you can do those three things and you adjust and transform, you can live with your like both eyes open to the climate crisis. You can be active, but you protect your mental health and you have the toolbox to rely on if things get tricky. So
Mhm.
I've from my personal experience, I find that model to be really true of how I've moved through it. And I've talked to so many other kind of frontline climate professionals who have similar ways of digesting, getting to that far side of grief or despair or anxiety. And that to me is what resilience looks like.
Nice. Well, I know, Britt, that you've also recently founded a new nonprofit called Unthinkable Earth. What can you tell us about that? And, where can listeners go to learn more about this work that you're doing?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So Unthinkable was really created because at my newsletter, Substack newsletter, Gen Dread, we hear from a lot of people all the time, all over the world, who are in need of resources to support their good mental health and well-being in the face of their climate awareness and to support their change making in ways that are personally sustainable, given how heavy it can be out there. And so Unthinkable is an evolving, vetted, curated resource hub so that people with really diverse experiences can come and find something that might speak to their needs. But we also have pedagogical tools, a film, a book, ways in which to help people have difficult conversations about these topics with their loving circle of friends and families and their coworkers. We have forthcoming courses and certifications for, yeah, basically psychological resilience training and existential mindset building to take on the long haul work of this. Even if you don't think that you're an activist, if you care and you're awake to what's going on, you have the potential for change making. And there's a lot of what the climate aware therapist Caroline Hickman has called internal activism that needs to be learned and exercised in order to support that kind of external change making that we know we need to be a part of today. So Unthinkable is set up to help people connect, hopefully as conveniently as possible to finding those resources and tools that meet their needs. Because
Awesome.
it's a wild west right now. Like there's so much popping up to meet people's
Yeah.
distress, hopelessness, despair, anger, outrage, but it's just we don't have the data sets yet to show what's most effective and for whom. And it's scattered all over the internet in places
Mhm.
that are hard to find. So we're trying to centralize and put forth those that we have the best understanding of what works based on the limited available evidence. And then it will just keep evolving as the research evolves.
Amazing. So, folks, for the listeners, you can head over to unthinkable.earth to learn more about the nonprofit. You've got Britt's book is again titled Generation Dread. You can find that with all major booksellers. And also, you've got your Substack, Gen Dread, fantastic resource. So, lots of amazing places to learn more about this topic. Thank you so much, Britt, for coming on the show. I really loved your book. I love what you're bringing to the field. I think these are important conversations that we need to have because climate change is something that affects all of us. This is going to be a new reality for us, and we need to foster more resilience across the board.
Thank you so much, Cassie. Yeah, and similarly, I loved your book. I was telling you that before we started recording.
Thank
And
you.
just if I may, what is it, given how challenging and how much of a big hyper object your problem that you're trying to wrestle with is, and
Mm.
antibiotic resistant bacteria, it's interesting to compare notes. Like, how do you
Yeah.
remain hopeful if that's how you feel? Or is it more just courageous and convicted because of the need? How do you deal with those feelings of overwhelm when it comes knocking?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly to what you're describing with the climate crisis, it's a combination of optimism, a combination of knowing that, optimism that we'll find a solution. There's a sense of dread of, "Uh-oh, what if we don't find a solution and we're back to, medicine of the 1800s where you get a
Mhm.
scratch in the garden and die." There's
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it's grim.
Which is, not so unreasonable when you think about rising rates of resistance. I think I get my encouragement from my colleagues that I see continuing to push forward, to innovate, to try and do what they can. And I think that that holds true for climate work as well. So,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of similarities.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know listeners are going to have lots of questions for you. So, again, where can they go to find you on social media or on your Substack again, so they can maybe reach out or they can subscribe to your newsletter?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you. You can find me on Instagram at GEN_dread. You can find the Substack at gendread.substack.com. You can find me personally at brittwray.com. You can contact me there. Lots of different ways. Yeah. And
Awesome.
thank you so much for having me. It was
No,
good to
thank
chat.
you. Awesome. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in each and every week, and thanks to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for putting on a great show. You can find the show at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. We've also got links to our YouTube channel there. And of course, if you want to support the show, you can buy me a coffee, which is always very, very welcome through Buy Me a Coffee link on the podcast website. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.